You're now listening to Coker's Chronicles.
Hello, everyone. My name is Shay Coker. Welcome to the third edition of Coker's Chronicles. Before introducing my guests, I'd like to thank our viewers who are part of IERG, which is the International Executive Resources Group. It's a unique global organization of internationalists with diverse experiences that enable its membership to connect, network, collaborate, and identify opportunities, learn from each other, and accelerate commerce to make this world a better place. I'm fortunate to be a member of the board, and it's a great organization of business leaders. Check it out at iergonline.org. That's iergonline.org. All right, today my special guest is Stephan Livera, who has, in my opinion, the world's best podcast on Bitcoin and Austrian economics. He woke up bright and early on a Friday morning in Sydney to be with us. So thanks for joining us, Stephan.
Thanks for inviting me, Shay, and thank you. That's very flattering.
Sorry, I pronounced your name slightly incorrectly. I say Stephan. It's more Stephan.
That's fine.
All right.
That's fine. I'm used to either. Either of those are fine. Yeah.
I used the wrong syllable. So Stephan, you've done over 175 episodes at last count. You've interviewed the top technical guys in Bitcoin, founders of Bitcoin related firms, economists, and even someone in the news a lot lately, Jack Dorsey, who is the CEO of Twitter and Square. How did you get involved in Austrian economics and Bitcoin, and how did you decide to start a podcast?
So the Austrian Economics story is, I was a teenager and I was hanging out on IRC, Internet Relay Chat, and I was on some Australian politics channel, and this guy kept linking to Mises Daily articles, right? And so I was maybe 14 or 15 at the time. At the start, I thought, oh, what is all this stuff? This is crazy. But it sort of dawned on me over time, and it sort of started to make a lot more sense, because the things that I was reading in those Mises Daily articles made so much more sense than what I was getting taught at school and later at university. So I couldn't quite put my finger on why is this better? And later I sort of got more into understanding, okay, it's actually the methodology of the Austrian school that just makes a lot more sense, right? So that's kind of the Austrian story. In terms of Bitcoin stuff, I, like most people, ignored it the first time I heard about it and saw it. So I don't remember exactly when, but we're talking 2011 or maybe like early or mid 2012. It's probably around then. I can't remember exactly, because it's kind of one of those, you see it on the news and you just kind of, it goes by. You didn't actually look into it. The thing that really was my aha moment for Bitcoin was actually reading an Eric Voorhees article so this was December 2012. And so in that article, Eric spells out some of what is possible with Bitcoin, how Bitcoin may challenge central banking. And look, in those days, some of the vision was kind of like, fast, cheap payments and so on, which is kind of, now that's like a Bcasher sort of thing. But basically at that time, that was like, it was a range of these different narratives, right? And so now I think arguably the whole digital gold kind of idea is probably a more precise way of thinking about it. Although even that's not accurate either, but I think that's a little bit closer. That's a little closer to correct. So in terms of why did I start my podcast, I was fundamentally frustrated with the level of the material in the space. I wanted there to be a good, honest source of information that, quite frankly, if I were not a podcast host, SLP, Stephan Livera Podcast, is the podcast that I would listen to. That's kind of my guiding light in that way, because I was really frustrated with the constant amount of just, basically shitcoin shilling, right? Like, it was just like, get this guy on and he will pay for a slot on the show. And, and then, look, it's blockchain technology and, it's, all this other like stupid stuff, right? And then at that time, so one of the OG podcasts back in those days, Let's Talk Bitcoin, right? They started their own altcoin and they did all this altcoin stuff, and they just weren't doing as many like solid interviews. And then there was like Epicenter BTC, but they were just doing all these, again, like crypto sort of interviews. And then, yeah, so there just weren't that many, right? So with a few notable exceptions aside, so things like Noted Podcast, Tales from the Crypt, at that time, Bitcoin Knowledge by Trace Mayer, and some of the stuff by like World Crypto Net, so people like Vortex and some of those guys, they were doing good stuff. But I think that was essentially what made my show a little bit more different, because it was something that nobody else is really doing. It was sort of being done in a certain way with a certain consistency also. So I think that's also what people want. They want high quality consistency, right? And that's basically, I treat that as, that's part of my product. That's my delivery, right? Like my deliverable, if you will, is to do good quality interviews and just put them out regularly so that people can regularly, now in normal times when they're driving and going to work and whatever, or the bus and the train, they can listen. Obviously during Corona times, it's a little different, but I still think,
And they get to watch you on Corona
we're
times.
kind of coming out of this a little bit, and then, yeah, we'll see. Sorry, I missed you.
They're able to watch you now in Corona times as well. So see you
right.
on video, right?
Yeah, trying to do more of the video live stream, just because I feel like for some people that's really helpful. I had some listeners who say, hey man, I would love for you to do video as well. So I'm giving this a try. I'm still not 100% like must do video. I would still be open to doing like audio pre-record, just like my standard style. But I think it's one of those things where YouTube is the world's second largest search engine. Can I really just ignore that? So
right, absolutely. So I had a couple of questions from our guest today before the show even started, and they were confused about what Austrian economics was. In fact, they thought I meant Australian economics, since you're from Australia. What could you help explain what Austrian economics is?
Sure. So this is funny because people often confuse this all the time. They think, oh, Australian and Austrian, and especially because I'm from Australia and I live in Australia. So Austrian economics is a school of economic thought that started with Karl Menger, who was an Austrian. Now, part of the reason it's called Austrian economics is it was distinguishing against German economics at that time, right? So it was sort of seen like almost like a put down or an epithet. It was like, oh, that's Austrian economics, right? But nowadays it has come to be known for practitioners with a particular method. We would call that method praxeology. So we would assess, so essentially the methodology of the Austrian school is essentially to take certain facts or certain truths that we know and then reason in a deductive fashion. And so that results, there's a lot of different things that can be reasoned out or deduced from that, if you will. And so that is, I guess that's the quintessentially defining aspect of the Austrian school, as Ludwig von Mises talks about. In terms of like in practice for most people, like if you're not really clear, Austrian economics, most of the practitioners nowadays are in the US and typically is known as a free market school of economics. So they are very much for this idea of emergent, bottom-up ways of interacting and just having respect for the information conveyed by prices and having real respect for these notions, as well as, and another, I guess, quick example is other schools of economics may be focused very much on aggregate level statistics, things like aggregate demand. If I'm a Keynesian, I'm thinking, oh, what's the aggregate demand? What is the output gap that my central bank or my government needs to step in and fill the void, etc. Whereas an Austrian is thinking, no, hold on, that's not qualitatively right. You need to actually look at what's going on at the individual level, at human action level, right? So because one of the founding ideas, if you will, is man acts purposefully, right? So that's one of the famous, so that's human action. That's Ludwig von Mises's, his magnum opus is titled Human Action. And basically the idea is man acts purposefully, and from that, what can you reason out and deduce? And so there's obviously, if for listeners who are interested, go and check that out. One good book is Economic Science and the Austrian Method, which is by Hans Hermann Hoppe, which is a great, if you're interested in like the exactly what is the methodology, that is a great book.
Cool. I know Texas Tech, where I went to school, has a free market institute nowadays, but they didn't back then. I majored in economics, and I was ruined for life.
It's all over.
That's right.
Ruined.
So before talking about Bitcoin, I'd like to talk a little bit about economics and money. Central banks, as you know, have been kind of printing money at record levels well before this crisis even hit. And that's led to several different issues, but one of them is simply exchange rates, right? For example, Brazil over the past few years has experienced nearly a 50% depreciation against the US dollar. And that's actually a pretty good situation compared to Argentina, where 10 years ago it took 4 pesos to buy a dollar. Today it's 68. And that's, leaving aside countries like Venezuela, which can't even measure their inflation. These fluctuating exchange rates have a big impact on companies and consumers, obviously, in these countries. Why is the current fiat system flawed in your view?
Oh, where do we start? So look, I think the fundamental problem is that it's too credit and the interest rate and basically credit has become too cheap. It has become this system where, because of legal tender laws, because of the central bank, because of fractional reserve banking as an overarching system, when banks lend money, they are essentially loaning new money into existence. That has really bad impacts on the whole economy, because the economy needs to be able to use price signals and interest rates in a sane way, where right now it's more like there's this constant distortion in favor of the people who are closest to the monetary spigot. So that's the terminology used in the Austrian Economics books, where they say essentially, in this fractional reserve banking system, the closer you are to the new money, the better off you are. So I think that's probably a good explanation of why financial services and banking have such high salaries compared to other sectors, because they're closest to the monetary spigot. And you could arguably say even over the decades gone by, maybe property development companies are closer to the monetary spigot. Maybe that's why they've been able to access all this cheap credit and do all these projects and so on. Maybe that's an explanation. Even big tech, you could argue that they have had all this access to cheap credit and they have benefited greatly from that. So I think there's some examples of what has gone wrong, and in the Austrian parlance, we would term that malinvestment. So it's essentially suggesting that the interest rate is an important signal, and the market needs that to help coordinate the production of goods. And so the way an Austrian economist would explain that is something like, we want a free market exchange rate, interest rate, and exchange rates, and fundamentally what we have seen, and to the point you were making about, Brazilian currency, Argentinian currency versus the US dollar, I think it's still a US dollar world and we're all just living in it, right? So I think it just fundamentally, the short way to explain this would be the US is exporting their inflation all around the world, because they've got a lot of bag holders, so to speak, and they know that other people would rather use the US dollar. And so it sort of becomes this scenario where the US dollar, for all of its problems, is like the least bad of the bunch. And so that's kind of one thing there. I think depending on the different country, some of them just naively just print, and others it's more like they're setting up this system that enables all this creation of money by the commercial banks, not the central bank, but that still has bad impacts for all of us, average people out there, that we basically have our money devalued, we have economy bubbles and malinvestments occur. So that's, I guess, in a nutshell, that point.
Yeah. Following up on that, in the commercial real estate world, in almost every lease that we have, at least here in Miami, South Florida, there's a minimum of 3% escalation baked in every year. in Brazil, they use an official inflation index that their leases are tied to. So you're paying more every year. Why does this happen? And whose fault is it?
So I think these are some of the impacts that have come from central banking and legal tender laws and all these interventions into the market, right? So things like explicit and implicit bailout guarantees, capital gains tax laws, all of these things, right? So fundamentally, our money is just losing value over time. And so commercially, the way people try to counter for that is CPI, right? But then the problem is obviously, how do you measure it? Because the CPI is a basket. So people can sort of play with what goes into that basket. So I think that it will just by its nature, it will always be subjective what goes into that basket. Do you count, cheap, mincemeat, or do you count ribeye steak, right? It's
Right.
like, and how do you adjust for qualitative things, right? The TV in the 1970s compared to like LCD fancy TV today, totally different features. How do you sort of easily compare those? And so we're living in this world where it's just, we don't really even have a solid ground to sort of put on. Not that money is like meant to be, money is never neutral, right? This is another point that Austrians are very careful to emphasize. But the point being, it would be a better reflection of society's preferences and of society's ability to get certain goods or to produce certain goods.
I listened to your episode with Philip Bagas, who's a professor in Spain, an economics professor. Very good episode. Highly recommend it. Where you talked about deflation and inflation. How do Austrian economists define inflation, and why is it a bad thing?
Right. So inflation in the Austrian parlance is typically, so distinguish between money supply inflation and price inflation. So they're the two main ones. So I think the Austrians, well, as I read them, they tend to be more focused on the money supply inflation because that was the typical inflation in the past, right? I think they would see the price inflation is just a downstream consequence of money supply inflation. That's probably the way they would distinguish it. But we still have to understand that there are different types of inflation and deflation. So I think for me, the canonical answer on this is Dr. Joseph Salerno's A Taxonomy of Deflation. There's 4 types. There's probably 2 that like your listeners are mostly interested in. One is growth deflation, which just means over time, we're seeing a benefit because technology, because we're getting better or we're more specialized in our labor. So just over time, just the price of things should be coming down over time because we're getting faster, more efficient, whatever, right? The other one that most people focus on, and this could quote unquote be the bad deflation, is bank credit deflation. This is like the credit collapse. This is 2008. That's that scenario. And so the first level way of thinking of that would be something like, oh, that's really bad. Like, oh, there's this credit collapse and oh my God, like the economy's going to blow up and it's all over. But if you understand the lesson from, say, Guido Hulsmann's text, Deflation and Liberty, we would understand that that is actually a natural corrective. That should be seen like it's like the drug dealer going to rehab, right? It's like, you got to go to rehab. You can't just like keep taking drugs. You got to, at some point, you got to just you got to kick the addiction. And so Guido Hulsmann and other Austrians who agree with him on this point would essentially say, look, it's not that the resources of the economy are disappearing, right? There are still people out there. There are still computers and property and printers and all this equipment that you can use in a business. It just needs to be repriced and allocated into different areas so that this entrepreneur will take that computer, this other entrepreneur will take that printer, and they'll use it as part of their business that is hopefully a profitable business and therefore productive for society. Hopefully that helps.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know what Australia but the US national debt is approaching $26 trillion. I can't even count that high. How does the government do it? And what are some of the potential consequences of this?
So yeah, I think this is just like that really big question that everyone's trying to grapple with right now. And obviously, as the US is, one of the leaders in the world, everyone's kind of focused on what the US is doing, at least the US government. And it's insane, the level of debt. And that this cannot be repaid, right? It's eventually, it's going to hit a point where even the tax revenue of the US government is not enough to fund the interest repayment on that debt that it owes. And you look at some other guys like I remember years ago there was this guy Lawrence Kotlikoff, and he was doing this analysis on what's the gap in terms of future obligations that the US government has in terms of social security and so on, and the future tax receipts that are projected. And there was like that gap was even bigger because it's just going to get worse and worse. So I think it's becoming very clear to everyone now that there is no honest way out of this, right? The government is just simply not going to be able to repay everyone that debt is not going to get repaid in an honest way. The cynical, dishonest way that it might get repaid is essentially inflation, right? Over time, they're going to try to grow the economy and have enough inflation will occur such that they are repaying you back in money that is worth a lot less than it was when they took that debt out. That's, in my view, the short answer. So there's obviously, there's bad, actually another good episode on this is my episode with Andy Edstrom, where we talk about the, bad menu options for dealing with this debt. And I think the likely scenarios are the inflationary ones. Although I would be cautious to not say, oh, we're going to hit high inflation immediately, because people have made that call for years and years and years, and they've been wrong, right? So you have to step back and think, well, hang on, was there something they were missing? Maybe this is something they didn't quite understand about the system, or maybe it's just one of those gradually then suddenly things. So until people actually lose faith in a particular currency, they're still willing to bag hold it. And for now, and probably for at least the short to medium term, the US dollar is probably the least bad of a bad bunch, if you will, right? So most people don't think the US dollar is like fantastic, but they realize that it's probably better to be in the US dollar than in, say, Argentinian currency or Brazilian currency or whatever. So for that reason, I think the US kind of benefits from that. And so we have to understand as well, this inflationary system that the government sets up, it is one of the big beneficiaries of this system, because if you're in debt, you benefit from an inflationary system. If you are a saver, you're the one getting destroyed. You're the one getting punished for that behavior, your insolence.
The current scenario makes it very difficult to save. You don't earn any money if you put it into a savings account, right? Put your money into a savings account. Yeah.
And that's why people are looking overseas, or they're getting chased into the stock market. They're getting chased into real estate. They're getting into something, even though there's risk with that, but they just have to put it into something, or otherwise they're just losing. And look, okay, some people do just sit on cash, but then it's financial repression. Basically, the inflation rate is higher than the interest rate that you're getting for keeping your US dollars in the bank or whatever, or even under the mattress or whatever, that you're paying the inflation tax.
Right. So let's switch the conversation a little bit. And I see there's a couple of questions I'll get to in a little while. But switch the conversation to something really good, which is Bitcoin. So, in the past, Bitcoin was kind of painted by the media as something that money launderers do, that criminals use to buy drugs or whatever. Today, all that has changed. A good example of that is my dad, who's a 73-year-old dentist in East Texas, who, by the way, he loves your show.
Awesome.
And that are using it. A lot of people got sucked in when the value went up in 2017. But today there's all sorts of financial instruments. There's all sorts of a flourishing amount of companies involved with Bitcoin. There's Bitcoin ETFs. the New York Stock Exchange launched a Bitcoin futures contract called Backed. All sorts of options for retail and institutional investors alike. Could you help define Bitcoin and kind of how it's shed its negative image today?
Yeah, so Bitcoin can be thought of two ways, right? So it's like a payment network and a token that transacts on that payment network, if you will. And maybe it's more precise to think of it like a settlement layer or a settlement network, if you will. But the short way to think of it is it's kind of like digital gold, but even like we mentioned, gold is not necessarily the perfect analogy, but it's just something useful to think of. Now, it basically is the result of decades of computer science and cypherpunks who are trying to create this idea of digital money, of peer-to-peer cash. And so the way to conceive of Bitcoin is, I think, it's two prongs. It's savings technology and it's payments technology. And it's savings technology that you can use, that you can, in some sense, financially exit or benefit from by keeping out of, because it's sort of so off on its own outside of the typical financial system. And that has some benefits for you if you're a holder, or if you want to be able to send money internationally, or if you want to be able to save money. And then on the payment side, it's known for, it's being designed for censorship resistance, meaning if you wanted to pay anyone anywhere in the world, the Bitcoin network won't stop you. Whereas if you are, transacting through your typical bank or PayPal, they will have to, use these various controls on you to basically assess and screen your transactions. They will have to ask you questions. What is your source of wealth? Why are you withdrawing your money? You'll get all these questions. Whereas in the Bitcoin world, you don't have that. It's more like you can self-custody, you can be your own bank. And that's really the beauty of it. In terms of its professional image, I think it's one of those things where I want to be honest about it, right? Because there are people who do use it for illegal things, but I also think there are the vast majority of people who are using it for legal things, right? They just want to save, or they just want to, they just want to be able to save their money. So it has gone through these phases, right? So in the early days, it was cypherpunks and libertarians and people like that, and like people who are into the Silk Road and drug markets and stuff like that. But I think nowadays it's really changed. So I think, though, we can't try to argue, oh, see, there's not that much like illegal activity on there and therefore it's all okay. I think it's it's one of those things where people just have to be comfortable with, like, yeah, I'm sorry. Sometimes it's, maybe part of this also turns on how you think about, say, the gun control debate or something like that, right? Because you might say, well, look, people can use guns for bad things, but at the same time, people can use guns for good things too. So it's kind of, it sort of depends on that. The way I view it is sort of similar to that in some ways, because yeah, you can use it for illegal things. But I think on the whole, we would say the vast majority of Bitcoin users are just using it for legal things.
Yeah. You could say the same thing about cash as well, right? I mean, it can be used for good and bad things.
Exactly. And it's one of those things where the media love to play it up, right? They love to play up the whole Silk Road drug, because that gets clicks. And you have to think about what's in their incentive. They want people to click. And if they just say, oh, look, drug market with Bitcoin and blah, 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 and it all kind of weaves into a nice story that will get a lot of clicks, and then they will get a lot of ad money from that. So just be skeptical of that, I would say. In terms of like actual numbers, you can look at some of these chain surveillance companies like Elliptic and Chainalysis. Some of these companies, they do reports occasionally on what percentage of the Bitcoin economy is doing illegal stuff. And so, or at least is associated with darknet markets. It's I think it's under 10% last I checked, but basically it's not a huge percentage of Bitcoin use.
Interesting. I didn't know about that one. Why do you focus more on Bitcoin and not these other cryptocurrencies? I think there's probably, I don't even know how many there are these days, thousands, but cryptocurrencies such as Ethereum, Ripple, even Bitcoin Cash, which a lot of people confuse, especially novices, with Bitcoin.
Yeah. So for me, basically all other cryptocurrencies are just riding the coattails of Bitcoin. I think it's like a cargo cult mentality, right? So for people who aren't familiar with the cargo cult idea, it's like, I think during wartime, there were some US military people who would land on certain islands, and alongside with that, they would like have supplies and things like that. But then once the war was over and they no longer needed those bases there, they stopped flying and landing there. But then people on the village on the island didn't quite understand. And so they would like set up their own little runway or whatever, kind of fake runway, not a real plane, and like hope that like the people would still fly there and drop supplies to them. But they weren't understanding, like they were just taking one piece of it and not understanding the overarching ecosystem and the overall architecture of how it all works together. And so that's how I view a lot of these altcoins. Now, there are some that maybe, there are people who are trying to honestly make something different. But I think in the vast majority of cases, it's people who are using a very paper thin justification to then print money, because, hey, those who can print money will. And crypto is not scarce. Bitcoin is scarce. Crypto is not, because anyone can just make a new altcoin and they will make some really paper thin justification. They won't tell you about the security trade-offs that have been made to achieve that. They won't tell you about how unnecessarily complex that thing is. In the case of Ethereum, in Bcash, they won't talk about the trade-off that they made in terms of making it more and more of a miner controlled thing, whereas Bitcoin is not controlled by miners. Bcash very much can be. So there's a few different things there, but it just takes some time and learning to sort of understand some of these different nuances about, okay, why is it not necessarily more scalable to use Bcash? Why is Ethereum overcomplicated and just over-engineered and just not actually a good system? Why, are some of these other coins that are marketed as like privacy coins, like things like Zcash, where basically no one uses the shielded transaction function? Some of these coins, they become, in the good case, they're more like a science project that should never have been monetized and should never have been tried to turn into money. And then in the negative case, it's more like, if you were taking the even more cynical view, it's basically these people are just paper thin justification because they want to print the money and they want to be the new central bank. It's like, welcome to the new system, new bosses, same as the old bosses kind of thing. Whereas Bitcoin, we're genuinely trying to do something different. We're trying to make a money that is actually decentralized in terms of its development, in terms of the mining, in terms of the use, in terms of the merchants, in terms of all of these things. It's actually more decentralized and actually, more resistant to any kind of individual person, individual company, or government trying to co-opt the protocol and co-opt Bitcoin.
Bitcoin has a total, it has a limited supply, right, of 21 million Bitcoin that will ever be produced. Where are we at today, and why is this a feature?
Yeah, great question. So today, last I checked, it's like 18 point something million. So most of the Bitcoins have already been mined, right? Like we're already kind of getting to that point. It'll just take 100 years or whatever for that last these last pieces of Bitcoin to get mined. So in terms of why that's valuable, I think that comes down to everyone having a credible. I think it makes a lot of sense in that people can more credibly claim this is scarce. We know the inflation rate. We know the emission schedule or the inflation rate or whatever you want to call it. It's known in advance. And so that gives people more confidence. Now, I don't know whether Satoshi was thinking that way at the start. I think it just happened to sort of work out that way. And the way Nick Szabo explains this is something like, hey, it's a Schelling point. It's 21 million and everyone's just agreed to that. So now it's not changing. Whereas if you started to say, well, let's start having inflation or more or less, then the question is, how much inflation? Should we have 5% or 2% or 1% or 15%? And what do we do? And we'd have all these questions. Whereas if it's 21 million, it's just kind of, it's scarce, it's known, everyone agrees to it. So we don't know whether Satoshi was like intentionally planning it out that way. maybe he did that by accident, and it just so by accident happened to be what worked. I guess no one will ever know, but my speculation or my suggestion is that had a big impact. I think that's probably one of the most important factors, is having a limited schedule, limited supply is what really makes it incredibly scarce and incredibly interesting. Because for listeners who aren't familiar, if you've read this guy, Julian Simon. So Julian Simon's thesis is basically anything on this earth that humans want more of, if we put more time and effort into it, we can make more of it, or we can economize our use of it, or we can find a substitute. That's kind of the short version. And so what happens historically is, as a commodity becomes more and more scarce, obviously what happens? The price goes up. What does that price rise do? It incentivizes new entrepreneurs to rush in and find something, to find it. They try and innovate, to find a way to make it cheaper, right? Like the shale gas revolution or whatever, right? Like all these things are just examples of that tendency. Now, Bitcoin is pretty much the only thing that resists that tendency because of the difficulty adjustment, meaning the schedule stays. Regardless of how many Bitcoin miners are thrown at the Bitcoin network, the schedule of 21 million is still on track. Or most, like, it varies slightly. It might advance forward or back on that track, but it's still 21 million and it'll never go more.
Right. So most of the people, or many of the people on this this webinar, are executives at multinationals or consulting firms, oftentimes responsible for the strategy and execution of their company. Very busy people. Why should they be interested in Bitcoin?
Well, because I think Bitcoin is really going to change the world. And potentially for you personally, I think it matters more, right, than for you as a business, right? But
right,
I mean, I think there will be business impacts on this also. But I guess the short version is we're going to see a lot of number go up, right? And people just naturally, when they see that, they want to get involved. They want some. They want a piece for themselves. And we're all human, right? We're all greed driven. We can't deny that. So that's obviously a big part of it. But I think more broader than that, for me, is more just like the promise of Bitcoin is like this free financial system that anyone can be a part of. I think that's really the promise that Bitcoin people are building towards, and they see that vision of, hey, imagine you could have a financial system where you can just set up, you can take payment online and no one can stop you. And it's going to take some time to get there, but that's the vision that I think people are building towards. So in terms of, for a business person though, I also think there are a lot of businesses today that are essentially on track to get wrecked, right? Like banks and so on, and all these, as an example, banks have a lot of mortgages. What happens to those mortgages when we see continual inflation, fiat inflation? The value is coming down. You need something that will help you protect against that. And well, I think Bitcoin is worthwhile considering for that, because essentially, if you're going to get destroyed by inflation, you need something that counters that inflation. And so that's why I think in a professional sense, it sort of makes sense to hold at least a piece, hold some pieces of Bitcoin in your portfolio, just because it's the thing that's going to really change the world and you'll need to own some of it, basically.
Awesome. So Bitcoin has lots of its own vocabulary, and some of the words that you've mentioned, I'm sure our viewers have no idea what you just said, but I want to go through a few of them, and if you could provide just a short answer for each one of them, that'd be great.
Sure,
HODL.
let's do it. So basically holding, right? The short answer is just holding, right? The origin story was this guy who was like drunk, and I think he misspelled it, and who wrote hodl, and that became a meme, and that became a thing now. So whenever we refer to hodlers, we're just talking about Bitcoin holders.
Satoshi white paper.
So Satoshi is the creator of Bitcoin, and he wrote the white paper in 2008, or released the white paper in 2008. Now, Satoshi is no longer involved with the project. Satoshi left, potentially after Gavin went to meet with the CIA. So I don't know exactly what, we don't really know why, but Satoshi is the creator, but Satoshi is kind of doesn't really matter now because because the project is being developed independently of Satoshi anyway, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. What are keys?
So what the keys are basically, if you imagine Bitcoin is a ledger of transactions, in order for you to move or spend those coins from one place on the ledger to another, you need your private key. So this is like a cryptography thing. You don't have to worry about do I have to learn cryptography? No, right? It's like saying, I can use Gmail or I can use email without setting up my own email server, right? Like you don't have to like understand the technical. The short answer though is hold your private keys. And so your Bitcoin wallet software would do that for you. If you're just new and just getting started, probably just get a Ledger or a Trezor. So these are some of the well-known hardware wallets. They will help you do what we call holding your own keys. That's probably the important part that you need to know for now. You'll learn more later as you get more into it.
Stacking sats.
So in the past, there was this mindset of, I'm just going to like buy and then sell later and try and trade and time it. Stacking sats is kind of like it's like the equivalent of dollar cost averaging. It's the idea of just buying every week or every month or every day for some people and just to regularly accumulate. That is the mentality that many Bitcoin people have now. They're not trying to like time the bottom and the top and try to be a trader. Most of us are not traders. We're not trying to be traders. We recognize that most traders lose money. So if you want to win this game, then just accumulate.
What is the Lightning Network?
So Lightning Network, Bitcoin right now is not necessarily good for small value payments. It's great for medium and high value payments. But for small value payments, I think the Lightning Network makes a lot more sense. And what the Lightning Network is, the short version is it's a network that allows you to kind of transact Bitcoin in a fast way without losing some of the security and the privacy guarantees that Bitcoin gives you. So it's sort of like opening a tab with somebody and then closing at the end. But it's not just a tab between two people. It's like you can set up all these networks, this network of channels, Lightning channels. And so again, I don't want to get too complicated for the listeners, but I would say if you want to just fool around with Lightning Network and just try it, I would recommend looking into these apps. So one is called Phoenix Wallet. That's a good one for Android. There's one called Breeze Wallet. That's a good one for iPhone. There's a few other ones out there like Zap. Another one is Wallet of Satoshi. So these are some of the easy ways that you can just get started with Lightning Network if you want to just play around with it. But I think for most people, they're more interested in the savings longer term aspect of it. But if you are interested in being able to use it day to day, then Lightning Network is for you.
You did great on those. How would you recommend for a novice user to start using Bitcoin?
So I've sort of changed my mindset a little bit. I used to think, start with a phone wallet. Nowadays, I think actually for most people, if you're in the developed world, right? So if you're sort of basically, if you have enough money that you could be buying, $1,000 or more of Bitcoin and probably more, it makes sense that you just start with a hardware wallet. So a hardware wallet is a tool that you can use. So again, I don't want to get too complex, right? So like I said, just get a Ledger, ledger.com, or a Trezor, trezor.io. So I would say just go there and start with one of those. So start with one of those wallets, buy it, and you'll get it in the mail. And couple of things there. So firstly, if you can, or don't order it to your home address just for privacy reasons. Try and get it to your work address or to a friend's address or a PO box instead. And then you plug it in and you'll have a setup process where you install, if you're getting a Ledger, you'll install Ledger Live. If you're installing a Trezor, it'll be a web wallet interface. And that interface will get you to write down 24 words. So you write down those 24 words and keep them safe. Then you want to get an exchange set up. So you want to either meet someone in person and give them cash, or just go to one of the well-known exchanges. So things like, Kraken and so on. If you're in the US, check out Swan Bitcoin. They're a sponsor of my show. I also hold an equity stake in them, but I think Swan Bitcoin will really help you in terms of dollar cost averaging. So I think that's a great way, or auto stacking, as we say, stacking sats, right? So basically the short version is, buy a hardware wallet, go to an exchange and buy some Bitcoin and withdraw the Bitcoin from that exchange into your hardware wallet. So your hardware wallet will generate an address. And so think of it like in the background, remember how we mentioned all that cryptography stuff? You don't have to know, but it will generate an address, and then you can withdraw from the Bitcoin exchange into your address. And then once it's in that address, you hold the keys, meaning you are the one who can exclusively choose to spend it or not.
Right. What are some of the things that you're most excited about in Bitcoin projects in the Bitcoin world?
There's so much. I mean, for me, things are developing so quickly that basically no one person can keep up on everything. So there's the Lightning Network developing really quickly. There's privacy techniques developing really quickly. There's work being done on protocol upgrades, so things like Schnorr and Taproot. There's aspects. There's just all these different technical aspects around Bitcoin that are growing up and building, and we're seeing more and more people come into Bitcoin now as well. So it's just an exciting time, because I think, well, not everyone believes this, but I do. I believe in this 4-year cycle idea. And so I think we're entering this new cycle now where, if you look back to 2016, say this time 4 years ago, it was also like a really good time to be getting into all this stuff, because there was more people signing up on exchanges. We're seeing a lot more new people come and ask about Bitcoin. It tends to just move in these cycles, right? So we have these kind of crazy momentum blow off top, and then a crash, and then some people learn. And now we've gone through the bear market for a couple of years, and now I think we're really entering that new bull market phase.
Oh, awesome. Bless you.
Yeah,
Is that a corona free sneeze there? I hope so.
Who knows? But I feel fine. So.
We have a question from Rafa, who asked about the debt issue. He said, "Isn't the U.S. debt a huge lie, in the sense that everybody knows it can never be repaid, and that everybody wants to keep? So if the U.S. defaults, it would drag the rest of the world?"
Good question. I think, maybe it's a bit like the emperor has no clothes, right? Everyone just kind of pretends that, let's all just agree to pretend that, the US government is not going to default on that thing, and we're just going to act like it's all fine. I think also we're just seeing the way people talk about it and think about it. We're seeing the rise of things like MMT style thought, modern monetary theory, or magic money tree theory, if you're more skeptical about it. But basically, we're just seeing more and more excuses and people who want to argue for an inflationary way out. And so I just see that's really the only way out. Like the US government is not like, okay, yeah, they'll raise taxes in certain ways, but it's just not politically popular. Right. I mean, yes, they could try to soak the rich, as it's known, right? Like, so maybe the poor and the middle class go after the rich people and say, oh, you made all this money and you're not sharing the gains with us, and blah, blah, blah. I think that will kind of kill the entrepreneurial spirit of the US, and the rich people will just leave. Why would they stay? So I think longer term, the only way out is inflation. And if you want to protect yourself versus that inflation, well, then that's where Bitcoin comes in. So I just don't see any other way out. I think, there's different options, right? It could be like debt jubilee, but then don't forget, one person's debt is someone else's asset, right? In this financial system that we live in, right? Because if I have a mortgage with the bank, that's an asset to that bank's asset side on their balance sheet. And so canceling out this debt it'll be really difficult to do that kind of thing. So I just think we have to think about what's politically most palatable, and we have to think about how politicians don't want things to go bad on their watch, right? Like, even Trump has tried to nail people in the past. I think Trump tried to nail, I can't remember if it was George Bush or someone else. He said, doesn't matter. It happened on your watch. And so it's seen like, well, that's your responsibility. You're not allowed to let bad things happen. And so if that's the mindset, then they are going to inflate for sure. There is just no other way out. So they will do what's most politically palatable. It's not politically palatable to raise taxes that high. I think it's more politically palatable to just keep the inflation going. They'll do. Now, maybe the system will kind of jerk and like violently kind of resist, but I think fundamentally they will do everything in their power to keep the house of cards going.
Yeah. So how can our viewers find out more about you? I know your website is stephanlivera.com.
That's the one. So yeah, so look, if you're interested to listen, I would recommend searching my podcast on any of the podcast apps, Spotify, Apple, whatever. Search Stephan Livera podcast. You can find me stephanlivera.com. And I would suggest also so basically just start with episode 1 and just start listening through. And I think what you'll find, one of the things with podcasts is it's not just the information, but it's also the enthusiasm, right? Like you sort of pick up like what should you care about? What should you be thinking about? And I think that's probably one of the benefits also. So a lot of people have gone through my podcast series and just gone from episode 1 through, and they've like come out the other end, like really quickly learning a lot of things about Bitcoin and what to think about, what's important, what's not that important.
Great. Well, I think that's it. Thanks so much for joining us and giving that excellent intro to Bitcoin. Really appreciate it.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Shay. You had a lot of great questions.